So, Hakim, in my participation in the program, you asked me who does the best grilled meat. I think that was a question, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly right.
And I am going to ask you a question, but I think you were very biased on the answer, but I want to know the answer anyways. You are an Iraqi, right?
Yes, that I am.
What is the best calligraphy? Kufi, Thilith, or Diwani?
You know what? Slini. The Sino-Arabic calligraphy is my favorite one.
I don't even know that one.
It's the Chinese one. The Muslims of China have their own form of calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy, and it's beautiful. It's very flowy and gorgeous. It feels separate from, the Persianate or other inspired versions of like Central Asia and whatnot. That definitely is a favorite. Of course, I'm assuming you thought I'd say Kufic.
Yeah, of course I thought you would say Kufi.
I will say, actually, unironically, I think it's a little bit overused. It's a very nice.
You think Kufi is overused?
Yeah, Kufic type is a bit overused. The Andalusian type is very nice as well, but the Sino-Arabic script or the Sino-Arabic form of calligraphy is the nicest.
Is it called Slini? Slini. Okay. Slini. I did not know that existed. So you see, I did not ask a very good question. I thought about asking something like who does the best music, but I thought that it was a little bit too much.
You know what? Actually, not the Iraqis. That's for sure.
Not the Iraqis.
Okay, I'm an outlier amongst my people. I am possibly the only Iraqi that is not that big of a fan of dolma, which is like essentially one of our main dishes. It's good, but it's not what Iraqis make it out to be. Every Iraqi is like, oh my god, I would kill for a plate of dolma. It's like, yeah, it's good, but it's not not that good, I think. And the second thing is, I'm not a big fan of our music. I think it's headache inducing. There's too much going on. All of it is so high energy, and I'm not in the mood for that. But every other Iraqi will disagree with me. So,
which Arabic music do you listen to the most?
This will make me seem like the biggest of boomers, but mostly Kulthum and Fairuz.
Yeah, that is a very boomer answer.
Exactly, because I am a boomer.
Yeah, that is very boomer. But from a Brazilian audience, it's like he's saying Maria Bethânia, or he's saying something like even older. It's much older actually. It's like Maísa, or I'm giving references so the Brazilian people understand what Kulthum is. It's like Maísa, vai is Portuguese. It's like Maísa, right? Okay, I got a little bit of Arabic themed answers from you.
There we go.
And we figured out there is Husseini calligraphy today, so there is our banter part, and I'll edit this out. Yeah,
no worries, yeah.
So Hakim,
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about yourself, and mostly, can you tell us when did you become a Marxist?
For sure. All right. Hello, everybody. I go by Hakim online. I am a far left, I guess, content creator. I personally identify as a Marxist-Leninist, and my content spans both my YouTube channel, which is just called Hakim, where I do, cover events. I do theory explainer videos, particularly Marxist theory. I do debunking stuff. I just have fun. And I also run a podcast called The Deprogram, where our lovely friend Ian here was a guest, and we had an absolute blast. So do check out the episode. This is a podcast I run with two of my friends who are also creators on YouTube, Nikki and Second Thought, and it's just an international anti-capitalist podcast where we banter, we laugh a lot. The humor is a bit crude, if you like that, as well as try to sometimes educate with quasi-academic topics or guests. My life, just generally, and a very quick summary. I professionally am a physician, and prior to this, basically, I was born and brought up in this country. Mostly in the capital, not my whole life, but mostly in the capital. And the point at which I basically turned into a Marxist or found Marxism was shortly after, I'm not that short, but shortly after the American invasion. I was still fairly young at the time, but once I saw the aggression of the United States and other NATO allies against Iraq and the sanctions and whatnot and the effects of this, and I didn't fundamentally understand why. And then subsequently, with me reading and educating myself, I found, Marxist critique of things and analysis of things, and that's what allowed me to fundamentally understand why the United States acted in what I, at the time, thought was a very rational way. Why are they spending trillions of dollars hurting their own population to go across the earth to damage another country which they have no real beef with? We never took part, no Iraqi took part in anything that happened during 9/11, for example. Iraq has traditionally not targeted American military or even economic interests in the region. The only thing that would have been considered, I guess, on the line was the nationalization of Iraqi oil in in the 70s, particularly in 1973, I believe. It was the first edict on nationalizing Iraqi oil, which pushed out British companies and American companies as well from the Iraqi oil production sphere. Anyways, so I had all these questions, and then finally I read into Marxism and I understood what is capitalism? Why does it work the way that it does? What is imperialism? I read Lenin. I studied the examples of the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese revolutions, and then on to modern day theory, the bleeding edge of Marxism, which is, for example, the concepts of unequal exchange and labor aristocracy, value transference theory, world systems theory. I'm talking about the works of Zach Cope, for example, Emmanuel Arguiri, Samir Amin, Torkil Lawson as well. These fantastic figures who have all written works that are incredibly relevant to us today. That is my quick summary, I would say.
Yeah, sure. And it's very familiar to me because in Brazil, many turning points for Marxism come from understanding what imperialism is. Lenin is very important. Lenin may be more of an influential figure for making people understand their position in the world more than Marx because of his book on imperialism. And in Brazil, the process is very similar, but we did not have a war waged against us like Iraq had. But we had a military dictatorship, which is our reference point for direct action of the US against our country. And as we are talking about the war, we would like to understand a little bit more about the origins of the war and the consequences of the invasion. What has Iraq become after the invasion, after the US left Iraq?
So for the relevant background, again, to just very quickly summarize it before I enter into the consequences of the invasion, the reason the United States invaded Iraq was first and foremost because of the incredibly important geostrategic location of Iraq, number one. The threat that we posed to the illegal settler colonial entity in the region. I believe everybody should know which nation I'm talking about. The one that's currently participating in massive ethnic cleansing. And of course, our incredibly lucrative natural resources within the nation, which don't only include oil. We have oil, we have natural gas, we have rare earth metals, we have even uranium in Iraq, which, by the way, if you're unaware, one of the first things that the American government did, the first coalition government edict or law that they passed was the privatization of Iraqi oil. And shortly after that, there is basically a part of Iraq in the southwest, I believe, is where the highest concentration was of uranium. And it's essentially a big mountain. And what the Americans did was they blew up the base of the mountain and essentially lifted up and flew it to the US because
what the fuck?
Yeah, exactly right. It is very what the fuck. Essentially tore it out of the ground to be able to remove this incredibly important source of uranium, amongst many other things that they did. But yeah, so these are the fundamental reasons why Iraq was invaded. There's a lot of other posturing. Oh, we had weapons of mass destruction, which was a lie and proven to be a lie. They knew that they were lying, but they lied nonetheless. Some nonsense about human rights at the same time as they supported several dictatorships around the world. So their human rights talks is all complete nonsense. You should never take the United States at face value. They don't give a shit about human rights. If they did, then they wouldn't be subjecting their minority populations, particularly their African American populations, to the ceaseless violence that they face every single day, or the continued genocide of the Native American population and their immiseration on reservations. So human rights they mentioned, but that's also bullshit. Another thing was supposedly Iraq was a threat to the region. Iraq was jingoistic. Iraq wanted to expand, blah, blah. All these were also lies. Every development, every war that Iraq took part in has been a war imposed on it. If we're talking about the Iran-Iraq war, this is something widely known by anybody who actually studies the material. And this is admitted also even by American historians of the fact the Iran-Iraq war was not something Iraq ever wanted. After the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran, which was neither Islamic nor revolution, they want to expand their particular new ideology into Iraq. Meanwhile, the Iraqi government was very welcoming to this new political force in Iran because we didn't like the Shah. Politically, we did not agree with them over a various set of things, particularly the falling apart of the discussions at Algiers based on a certain, disputes over land that occurred. But anyways, because the Iranians want to expand their ideological influence into Iraq, they would fly sorties. They would violate Iraqi airspace very frequently with fighter jets. They would attack certain military outposts. They would carry out raids across the border. And this is something that Iraq had complained to the UN about. And Iraq sent something like 270 notes to the UN about it and nothing happened. And then that's when Iraq officially invaded into Iran after we saw that the international community wasn't doing anything. That's number one. And number two, the Kuwait war was a war that happened as a result of slant drilling by the Kuwaitis into Iraqi oil fields, where basically they would drill in a specific way so that they would suck out Iraqi oil but sell it as Kuwaiti oil. Number one. Number two, they flooded the market at the time with oil in order to reduce its price so that Iraq couldn't pay back its debts, for a variety of reasons that they did this. And of course, again, Iraq went to the UN about this, that they did nothing, and then they specifically went to the United States and they told them, hey, this may escalate into a military conflict. We're letting you know this ahead of time, that this will be a military conflict. And at the time, the US government essentially said, we don't care about wars between Arabs, so if you guys happen to fight it out, then we're not going to do anything, essentially. So with the go-ahead, of course, of the United States, that's when Iraq launched its war against Kuwait. And then afterwards, we were very greatly punished for that at the time. And of course, the greatest traitor in all this was Gorbachev, who gave the green light to the United States for the invasion. The United States asked the Soviet Union at the time, because it was still around in 1991, they asked them, hey, we're going to invade Iraq. Are you guys okay with this? Is everything fine? And the Soviet Union was like, oh, you as the leader of the international community can do whatever you want, and we'll be behind you, essentially. Gorbachev is a despicable traitor, and he's rotting in hell, inshallah. The idea that Iraq was jingoistic and wanted to expand beyond its borders is complete nonsense as well. But those are the fundamental reasons that we were invaded. For resources, for the military threat we posed to one of America's quote-unquote allies in the region, as well as our geostrategic importance. After the invasion of the United States and coalition forces, by the way, I don't think any country has been invaded by as many nations as Iraq. What happened was, this is following, by the way, a decade of sanctions, which were, Iraq was essentially the most sanctioned country on earth, and I believe to this day still technically would be considered to have been the most sanctioned country on earth. Even Cuba and the DPRK aren't sanctioned to the same extent. Even if on paper they have other recourses for, the DPRK can kind of skirt these things by their trade with China, and Cuba has certain, things with Venezuela and Russia that allows them to kind of skirt stuff as well. Iraq didn't have any of these privileges. Regardless, the sanctions resulted in the unnatural death, which was supported by the United States government, the unnatural death of 500,000 children in Iraq because of malnutrition and other reasons. Madeleine Albright, who was, I believe, Secretary of State at the time, was asked this in an interview, and she was asked, do you think that this is do you believe that this is a price to pay? This is worth it. This price is worth it to pay for destabilizing Iraq, the death of 500,000 children. And she said yes. So she's a despicable murderer as well, and she is also rotting in hell, inshallah, along with all the rest of them. Regardless, following the sanctions, which I can talk about forever, the United States invaded. The invasion resulted in the complete decimation of the Iraqi state apparatus. The Americans made sure to divide Iraq along sectarian lines to prevent a unitary Iraq. This was a directed thing. They learned from the British, of course. This was a direct effort on their part to basically sow the seeds for perpetual disunity. Number one. Number two, they dissolved the army and fired all security personnel, which allowed essentially civil strife to exist because you had all these people with military expertise and military equipment, but no jobs and no way to support their families. They subsequently, of course, fought against the Americans and then between themselves. Number three, the economy was completely looted. The United States government essentially stole all the gold reserves of the Iraqi National Bank. There are even pictures of it online. They went into the Iraqi National Bank vaults and stole Sumerian gold necklaces, which are older by many thousands of years than the United States history. Things from as far old as 2,000, 3,000, even 4,000 before Christ we're talking about. So nearly 6,000 years ago. Jewelry and other artifacts that happened to be made of gold. The Americans also likewise, and coalition forces stole all our gold reserves, which were in many tons. You still have images of American soldiers carrying gold bricks. You can Google it right now, you'll see them. They stole that. I mentioned, of course, earlier, the Americans stole natural resources by immediately privatizing Iraqi natural resources, natural gas, oil, or rare earth minerals, and they right away got to essentially selling off contracts to Western conglomerates to exploit Iraqi natural resources. They even stole the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate is the gate of Babylon. It's a massive point of pride for the Iraqi population because this is a heritage of collective humanity.
If you don't know, João Carvalho, you know the other Brazilian communist that you invited for the D program, he studied Mesopotamia in his college years, and he speaks Low Babylonian, something like that. He can read Low Babylonian, so we know a lot about ancient Mesopotamia because of him. So we know about the gates of Ishtar.
I love it, yeah. But yeah, that Ishtar Gate, which was a heritage of collective humanity, was entirely stolen. It was, they put metal girders underneath the foundation and then airlifted it out of Iraq, and now it sits in a museum in Germany, in the Pergamon.
That is very bizarre. They rebuilt the gate. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful gate, but it's very weird to see. It's like seeing the pyramids in a museum. It's exactly that weird.
It's huge and it's beautiful, and we had to basically rebuild a copy. Meanwhile, the original is sitting in Berlin. Of course, this is not the only thing they stole. Tens of thousands of ancient artifacts have been stolen by the United States, to the point that there's some of them are decorating restaurants in the US, of all things.
Oh my God.
Yeah, exactly.
This happens in Brazil with indigenous artifacts. It's very strange. The indigenous pottery, the indigenous different, I don't know how to say that, made of ceramic.
Yeah, exactly. I know exactly what you mean.
They sometimes decorate restaurants and mansions of rich people that invaded the indigenous land. So it's that weird, that bizarre.
Yeah, exactly right. Amongst many other things, yani, the best way to put it, this is the example I always give. We have like oil field / city in Iraq. It's specifically it's a massive oil field. If you look it up, you'll find it. It's in the southeast of Iraq. It's called Majnoon. Majnoon literally means insane.
My grandmother used to say that. Majnoon.
Yeah, I love it. If you didn't know, by the way, it was a Brazilian petrol company that discovered.
Oh my God!
I believe it was the national like
Petrobras. Yeah, it was Petrobras.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're the ones who started the process for exploitation of the field.
Yeah, sure.
But the general like history of this is very interesting. During something called the Qadisiyah, which was the war of conquest by the Muslims of the lands of Iraq. One of the regions, I don't believe it was Majnoon, it could have been, but essentially the oil there is so easily exploitable. It's so surface level. If you don't watch where you're walking, you'll step on a spot on the floor and you'll fall into basically a vat of crude oil.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's sometimes you have them even like popping up. I remember in my mother's garden, there's a spot in her garden that wouldn't ever grow anything. And then finally we were wondering why, because everything would grow around, but that one spot wouldn't grow anything. And then at the time she dug it up and then she found crude oil underneath, crude oil that was flowing underneath.
Was that in Baghdad?
Yeah, slightly outside Baghdad. Iraq is an incredibly wealthy nation.
Yeah, sure.
Natural resources.
As Parenti says, you do not invade the poor nation. You invade the rich nation.
Yeah, exactly right.
See what's happening in the Congo right now.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah, perfectly said. Yeah. Anyways, what I was trying to tell you was this Majnoon oil field, which is incredibly lucrative, had entire battalions of American soldiers and coalition forces stationed there. And they were defending this with their life. This was so clearly their main objective. Meanwhile, the National Museum, which is in Baghdad, which at the time held the largest collection of most ancient artifacts of human history. We're talking about things from Sumerian era all the way through the Akkadians and Babylonians to the Assyrians, even up to Roman artifacts and further on. But the human heritage that was stored in this museum is unparalleled anywhere in the world. And the Americans put one tank in front of the entrance, which I believe at the end wasn't even manned, so the museum was looted and Iraq lost tens of thousands of artifacts.
As a historian, to listen to these stories, it makes me cold sweat, because losing historical artifact, you lose your possibility to understand history. And I know that Iraq had many artifacts because the Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians wrote on clay, and clay lasts for a long time. It stands the test of time. So there were many written tablets that got stolen or lost. I know of a story about tablets that were stolen and the ship sank and we lost the tablets forever. So oh my God.
Yeah, exactly right. So this is a living scar that we have to live with as Iraqis. But anyways, moving aside from this, these are like the material and political costs, obviously. So disunity and intentionally designed like fracturing of the nation, laying the seeds for sectarian violence and civil strife, complete gutting of the Iraqi economic system and environment, the theft of natural resources and artifacts, privatization. These are the big things. But of course, we can't skip over the human toll, which is over 1 million people who were killed as a result of the illegal American aggression and invasion of Iraq. Now, this is something you need to remember, is that the Iraqi population at the time wasn't very big. Iraq nowadays is 40-something million, 42, 43 million people. But if we're talking around the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010, we're 20 million people around, somewhere around there.
Yeah, it's very small.
25 million. Yeah.
Brazil is 220 million.
Exactly right. And to be like, we kill 1 million of you. This is a crime unparalleled. This is
It's like 5% of the population got killed.
That's not even the worst part. The amount of the destruction of education and scientific centers. Of course, the United States bombed even the Ministry of Education. They specifically targeted. We can never know if they intentionally targeted, but this is not outside what is normal for the United States. They struck with a missile. They struck the when you write up a PhD, when you do your thesis.
A postgraduate center or something like that.
Exactly right. Where basically almost every PhD written by an Iraqi within Iraq.
Oh, the library.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, they destroyed the PhDs.
Exactly right. It's not reserve library. I don't know what it's called, but basically they have like a copy of your PhD thesis, and it's stored in a national center of sorts. And they struck that, and they basically burned all of it was destroyed. Like thankfully, a lot of it was digitalized, so you still have it. But also there's things from like the 60s and 50s and earlier that are gone.
And this was like 2003, 2004, something like that. Even nowadays, many documents are not digitalized, especially in countries like Brazil and Iraq. So I imagine the amount of knowledge that got lost by striking something like that.
Of course. So that is a very quick, I guess, overview. I can go on forever about it, but this is what has happened.
I wanted to ask you two additional things. The first one is we hear a lot about how the Iraq invasion generated ISIS. It generated. I don't know how you feel about this name ISIS, the Islamic State. We sometimes call Daesh. It. Yeah, we say Daesh too. So we a lot of times hear that the Iraq War was the beginning of the formation of Daesh. You as an Iraqi, do you confirm that? Is there something you would like to add?
It's more nuanced. The formation of all these other groupings, not only Daesh, but also other related groups, this is something that never existed in Iraqi history prior. Between 1970 and 2003, there was not one single
quote-unquote terrorist group.
Yeah, exactly. Or terrorist attack in Iraq even. There was not one. Yeah. Not one person who went into a market and blew themselves up between the 70s and 2003. The Iraqi security apparatus was incredibly formidable and also was very good at weeding out these elements in society. So if somebody had this sort of inclination, they were found and then they were either corrected or imprisoned or what have you. So we didn't have this. The Iraqis don't know this, right? But with the invasion, of course, you had a righteous group of insurgents, essentially, people who drove the insurgency to push the Americans out. And alhamdulillah, in the end, they were successful. We bled the Americans dry in Iraq and caused essentially and this is another major pride of Iraq. I would say as an Iraqi, I have two major prides. We gave the world civilization and we destroyed American international standing. And we're the first step into the entrance of a multipolar world. These are my two greatest prides as an Iraqi, I would say. But this insurgency that destroyed the American forces within Iraq, part of the people that were at the time imprisoned in Iraq before 2003 were let out of prisons, right? And these people included murderers and criminals, people who smuggled drugs, as well as certain terrorist elements. They were in Iraqi prisons and they were released around the time of the invasion. And these people went into society and started, recruiting and doing what they do. And most of the recruiting that was done within American prisons. These people would be arrested by United States military or other personnel, American personnel or coalition personnel within Iraq. And then they would go into American prisons within Iraq where they would basically hold classes on terrorism. They would have I'm not kidding, they had classrooms with billboards and dedicated...
I believe you. I totally believe you. Here in Brazil, I had something similar. The Americans came to Brazil to teach our army how to torture, so that's not uncommon for them.
Yeah, exactly right. So to say that the Iraq War gave rise to it is too simplistic. The American invasion was the principal reason that this occurred, and the Americans heavily supported this development. The United States military apparatus and the people who run it, they're too smart to have overlooked this.
Yeah, sure.
Which basically means that this was intentional negligence to basically ignore this, because they understood that this will lay the seeds for civil disunity in Iraq for many years to come, which will allow Iraqi industry and natural resources to be exploited for many, many decades to come.
It was more of a personal question, and it's a very delicate question, so if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to. But how is it to live with the war going on in your country?
Yeah, it's not nice. I can tell you that much. It is. It's unsettling because you're uncomfortable. The best way I can put it is if you have an armed police officer in your home.
Inside your home.
Yeah. How uncomfortable that would be. You're in the living room, there's a guy standing armed looking at you, right? And people tell you, try to go about your life like regular. Try to talk with your kids as regular. Try to have your breakfast. Try to, but that's the feeling, right? That's when it was quote unquote peaceful. So that means the 2003 period, essentially, before the insurgency really took off in mid to late 2004. The Americans bombed indiscriminately, even residential neighborhoods, which is something that has not been documented very much, but it happened. The neighborhood I lived in was struck as well, for God knows what reason. We'd very regularly have to go basically into the basement of our home, which is we had a bathroom basically down there in the lowest point of the house, and it was the most quote unquote structurally sound area. So if a missile were to land or something, or shrapnel, whatever the fuck, if anything were to happen, then it maximizes your ability to survive. And we'd regularly be there. Every time an explosion happens, you feel the ground and the walls shake around you. It's very uncomfortable. There were months at a time when you'd basically you tried to go to bed and you just hear the air sirens the entire time, to the point that it maybe sounds a bit weird, but I find air sirens to be comforting because it was always a nighttime thing. So I would feel like, oh yeah, it's time to go to bed. I'm a bit like, sleepy.
That's crazy.
Right. Of course, then American military personnel would patrol regular streets and whatnot. They'd walk into your home willy-nilly. They didn't need a warrant or anything. They can just walk in. So we've had American soldiers in our home several times.
Did they speak Arabic?
Not at all. They were the most arrogant and disgusting examples of human beings I've ever met. I would say if you were to put a pig in military fatigues, but that's insulting to the pig.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, they were absolutely despicable human beings. They were the worst. I would almost feel bad for them, but then I remember that they're agents of capital and they all deserve the worst that could happen to them.
I can only imagine what level of brainwashing a American soldier has to go through to look at another human being like that, with such arrogance and such inhumane look.
The majority of them were murderers and rapists. They were sadistic. They followed no protocol. The only reason that any decency you'd see from an American soldier is because cameras were around. But otherwise, they're no different from the American soldiers that participated in Vietnam. Many of them killed indiscriminately. They commit other sorts of crimes. They stole. They raped a lot as well, which of course the American military establishment never talks about. This is something that they don't highlight.
I can only imagine what it takes to create such a person, such a being, such a thing.
Just the absorption of American exceptionalism while growing up.
Yeah. It's from birth. It's a society built upon these values. It's not even the army itself. About the worker situation in Iraq, we are communists and we are always looking at the worker situation. Was there a major change in Iraq economy after the war? I mean, did Iraq got deindustrialized? Its industry got damaged or privatized? Most of the economy today runs on services. That's the type of thing I'm asking.
The Iraqi government was, prior to 2003, put a lot of emphasis on industrialization. They came from a quasi-socialist tradition, after all. Baathism is an idea, and so that's why Iraq had several rounds of industrialization starting from the 60s. After 2003, Iraq has been almost entirely de-industrialized. Ali Qadri has several books on this topic, and he really lays out the numbers of how Iraq had become de-industrialized.
Does he have books in English?
Yes. All his books are translated. All the books are, I believe, written originally in English.
Oh, written. Ali Qadri. The name of the author. Okay.
Yes, exactly. All his works are fantastic. We'd love to have it. We're thinking of bringing him on the new program. He's fantastic. His work is genuinely really good. The only sector of Iraqi industry that had been somewhat spared was the oil processing and refining sector. But everything else, in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, Iraq used to produce TVs, like medicines, paper.
Yeah, Brazil
other sorts of electronic. Yeah, exactly. Other electronics. Iraq even had a satellite development sector at the time, which is insane to think because of how highly sanctioned the country was that we could even develop such a thing. But all of this is gone now. Iraq has also been historically incredibly lucrative agriculturally. That's because Iraq sits on, or at least between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We have an alluvial
since ancient times.
Exactly right. We have an alluvial plain which is incredibly fertile. You can spit out the seed of something onto the ground, something will pop out. Some people may have a strange image of Iraq and thinking it's mostly desert. The south and the west of the country, where basically nobody lives, is mostly a rocky desert. It's not even a sandy desert, but it is a rocky desert. But the north, northeast, east, and southeast is incredibly fertile. We have everything from dates, which is of course the biggest thing that we have. Iraq used to have the highest concentration and largest amount of date palm trees in the world, and this has been something historic. Some of these trees are centuries old, if not even older. I don't remember.
Dates are tamar, right?
Exactly, tamar.
Oh yeah, okay. I know in Arabic and I don't know in English, but
it's all right. Yeah, tamar. Yeah, exactly. And like I was saying, Iraq had the highest concentration and largest amount of date trees on Earth, and Iraqi dates are renowned globally as the best dates on Earth. And this was another agenda of the American invasion. The sheer destruction to the agricultural sector of Iraq, particularly to date trees, has resulted in the loss of something like 80% of the stock of date palms in Iraq. Just like senseless destruction of agriculture, things that were planted by our ancestors for
because dates take a lot of time to grow, right? The trees take hundreds of years to grow.
Yeah, they take quite, I believe it's 40 years.
Yeah.
But it's still a very long time. Like if you were to plant one as a young man, you'll be an old man by the time you get to taste the first fruit of it.
Yeah, so it's a generational thing, right?
Exactly, yeah. And Iraq is very, what's it called? It's a very huge part of our identity. Like historically, as well in Arabic, we call it Ard al-Sawad, which basically means like the land of dark earth because of the soil that we have and how fertile. Yeah, it is kind of to this day, but was particularly. Iraq also has many sorts of berries, grapes, melons, pumpkins, every vegetable under the sun that you can imagine, figs, peaches, and apricots and stuff like this. Think about it, Iraq can grow it essentially because we have also a diverse climate across the country because it's also a fairly big country despite its population. But the Americans first of all used a lot of depleted uranium in their missiles and their artillery and whatnot, basically. So a lot of the soil has been poisoned for centuries to come through the invasion, which also, by the way, results in Iraq having some of the highest levels of child cancers, leukemias, and lymphomas, as well as generally child malformations, birth malformations in Iraq as a result of this.
Vietnam suffered a lot with this too, with Agent Orange and whatnot.
Exactly right. But moving on from this, historically, what I was trying to get at is the agricultural sector within Iraq has always been very lucrative because you can grow everything and you can grow very large amounts of stuff. But this is essentially, this was the historic industry in Iraq prior to oil, and it's been also entirely decimated. In fact, now Iraq used to be a net exporter of food until the sanctions period, and then during the sanctions period, we basically produced enough to just feed our population. But ever since 2003, Iraq has become a net importer of food, and the fields that used to be cultivated and grown and whatnot are not any longer, which is a major decline in our economic standing. Aside from oil, really, there's no major industry in Iraq. Economically, the country has an incredibly high level of social inequality, number one. Number two, there's a very high level of unemployment. Number three, it doesn't even matter if you're employed, particularly in official government sectors or like a public, because salaries are very regularly 1, 2, 4, 5, 8 months late.
Oh my God.
Corruption is incredibly rampant in the country. You cannot get anything done without a bribe, essentially, and of course, understandably so, because life is difficult in Iraq.
Yeah.
The social consequences of the invasion also resulted in a complete decline of both secondary school and university attendance. Literacy rate has fallen. Iraq used to have a literacy rate of essentially 100%, but now I think it's hovering around between 70 and 77%.
Yeah, that's very
depending
low.
on depending on if you're a man or a woman and which part of the country you're in. Furthermore, of course, like the access to public services in Iraq is laughable. Hospitals are in horrible conditions. The roads and other infrastructure are crumbling, and like tunnel systems, sewers, irrigation networks, schools. There is not a major sense of improvement in Iraq since the invasion. On every objective measure, you could say, spare a very select few. Nearly every major measure of life quality and physical quality of life and human development index, Iraq has significantly declined. And you have to remember that prior to 2003, Iraq was a heavily sanctioned, in fact, the most sanctioned country on earth.
Yeah.
And it still had a better showing than the quote-unquote free and democratic Iraq.
We wanted to know too about the communist movement in Iraq, because we are talking about the destruction of the structure of the state and inequality. Here in Brazil, we are seeing a resurgence of the communist movement. We are reorganizing. It is growing rapidly. We are very proud of what has been going on with our movement here in Brazil. And we wanted to know, as people of the third country, as we may say, if that has been going on in other countries. So can you talk a little bit about the communist organizations historically in Iraq, and mostly, is there a resurgence of a communist movement in Iraq today?
The presence of Marxism within Iraq is very old. Marxism reached Iraq fairly early on, and particularly after the founding of the Soviet Union, with their impetus for supporting third world and just global communist parties, it really kind of took off. In the leading up to the 40s and early 50s, the Communist Party of Iraq was the largest communist party in the Arab world, but that crumbled because of major mistakes that they made politically, strategically. A lot of them across very stupid, silly perspectives. A lot of it was mechanical application of Soviet directives. A lot of it was a conflict between perspectives of mostly secular urban elites versus the vast majority of Iraq's population, which is not that. So yeah, they failed over incredibly simple mistakes at the end of the day. And of course, there's great repression of the movement. But following the success of the various revolutions at the time, of course, we had the Arab Socialist Union with Abdikarim Qasim, and then subsequently the Baath Party that came to power. And with this, there was kind of a codification or an integration of what existed of the leftist movement still, of the Marxist movement, I mean. So the communist parties that worked with the government were incorporated into basically like a fatherland front, almost. So they're part of like a ruling coalition, essentially. But the ones that were not part of this group essentially were repressed. After 2003, the Iraqi Communist Party threw their weight entirely behind the coalition government and the American invasion. So they are known as traitors in Iraq, and rightfully so. They are despicable traitors. They're disgusting for what they did. They entirely supported the American illegal occupation and invasion of Iraq. They put up zero resistance to the invasion of Iraq. I believe the Iraqi Communist Party is the only communist party across the world that in a moment of an external invasion, particularly by the United States, they did not take up arms against the illegal foreign occupier.
Yeah, that's kind of delirious, if I may say.
It's the only one. It's the only one that I know of historically. And of course, they participated in the joke that was the pretend elections in Iraq. By the way, there are no elections in Iraq. People will tell you that Iraq is a democracy, and particularly after 2003, Iraq is a democracy. Iraq has never been a democracy. The political participation, democratic participation within Iraq, is next to nothing. Sometimes some elections get like 20% of the electorate coming out, if even then. Number two, the votes are almost entirely rigged. There's everything from intimidation at the polls with like militia groups preventing certain people from voting for certain candidates to basically like dumping ballots or forging ballots and whatnot. There is zero recourse to political corruption within our so-called democratic system. So if you do end up being a corrupt person and get into power through corruption or through intimidation, through anything else, there's no system for getting you out, really. This incredibly rotten system the Communist Party participated in, which again is, like you said, very delirious. It's ridiculous that they did this. And since then, the Iraqi Communist Party has been essentially a dead and defunct movement. There are some people who occasionally show up on May 1st, you know, like May Day celebrations. You see some crowds, and sometimes you probably see some images. And it's a cute little thing that happens. But aside from this, there's next to zero organizing in Iraq. There's zero agitation. There's zero genuine leftist organizing happening in the country. The leadership of the Communist Party is highly ossified and ancient. They're stuck in their ways, and they want to, sit in an office. They want to have a nice office and drink tea is what they want. They don't want power. They don't actually care about the Iraqi people. It is a thoroughly revisionist and backward Communist Party. Doesn't even deserve the term. There's a few other Communist parties across Iraq, particularly in the Kurdish segments, and there's a bunch of other ones, but none of them are of any meaningful size or influence, really. So for all intents and purposes, the leftist movement in Iraq is kind of dead, and the current government is deathly afraid, is incredibly afraid of a resurgence of sympathy for the previous government, particularly their ideology, Baathism, which, by the way, if you were to really talk amongst people, you can't say this publicly, of course, because there will be very serious consequences. But if you were to, behind closed doors, talk to people, the vast majority of people will tell you, the previous government was, they did at least the major run-ins of the state much better than the current government. And there's, as the years go on, there's more and more sympathy for that previous government.
You mean the Saddam era?
Specifically the Baath area, the Baath party administration of Iraq. And the big thing in Iraqi politics is if you are to speak on Marxist platforms, specifically, or if you were to be like, hey, I want to nationalize this and that, I want to socialize this and that, I want to have this particular plan, blah, blah. All of this really parallels things that the Baathists want to do. So you're very quickly going to be labeled a Baathist, and there are basically 1,001 recourses, both legal and illegal, to deplatform you or worse. They dug their own grave. The Communist Party of Iraq dug their own grave by supporting the post-invasion status quo. So now they can't even run on communist grounds because they're going to be labeled as Baathists, and they'll be taken care of in that way. Very, very disappointing. I know this is a very depressing episode, but there are some things now developing. There is somewhat of an underground that exists within Iraq of various shades, but so far it's not much.
And you talked about the Baath movement and the persecution and praise that the people generally have for the Baath movement, I think mostly by comparison. And here in Brazil, we have an interesting phenomenon that is some political figures have an ambiguous position in the Marxist view. Talking about Hugo Chavez, I'm talking about Gaddafi, and Saddam is one of them. They are mostly praised by social democrats, but how you as a Marxist-Leninist view Saddam and the Baath movement?
I won't speak about Saddam specifically, but I'll speak about the Baath administration that used to exist within Iraq. Iraq.
Yeah.
And it's like exactly like you said, comparison is what will really put them on top. I'm not saying that they're a particularly good movement. And of course, as a Marxist, I disagree with some of their base assumptions. For example,
you said they were based on socialism, more or less?
Quasi-socialist. I'm going to go into it right now. Yeah, they reject class struggle, for example.
Okay.
Part of Baath is, they're class collaborationists, but they are more along like patriotic front lines, which means, for example, like they don't want comprador bourgeois in Iraq, but they want
national bourgeois.
The national bourgeoisie is considered to be progressive, for example. So very like right 1950 China type of perspective, right?
Yeah,
like,
sure.
New democracy almost, if you want to word it that way. But a bunch of other things, right? Of course, socialism is more than just nationalization of industry, so that's why I say it was quasi-socialist. But yeah, as a Marxist, I disagree with some of their assumptions as an ideology, but they are much better than what rules Iraq now, by leagues and bounds, much better. Education was protected, the position of women in society was protected, social services ran, and they ran very well. Hospitals in Iraq were great, universities in Iraq were great. We had some level of infrastructure that was getting investment, unlike now. We had a country we could be proud of because we had national production, we had our own agriculture, we defended our own borders, we did not have the drug abuse issues that we have in Iraq now, which by the way are extensive. Prior to that, there was no drug smuggling in Iraq whatsoever, essentially. Only at the very north, between the Iranian to Iraq to Turkish borders, was there smuggling. But otherwise, you would never find heroin addicts in urban centers. This is something very different now in Iraq. Vaccinations, literacy, very like on every one of these salaries, people having jobs, not being unemployed. Housing and the building of housing stock. The Iraqi government regularly gave out plots of land to government workers and would subsidize the building of homes on it. So basically, you as if you work, for example, I don't know, in the National Electricity Company or something, on your 7th year, you're going to get a plot of land in this part of Baghdad, for example, and you will have a subsidized contract with the national, like the brick building and all this kind of stuff, these particular enterprises. So you get significant discounts, essentially, on all building material and also on labor. The government will help you with that. So you get a plot of land, which you own, by the way. It's not that the government owns it. They gift it to you, and then you own it. And afterwards, they give you subsidized prices on building your own home so that you can build whatever you want, and then you live there. Of course, this was not a privilege that every single Iraqi had, but a good chunk of Iraqis did experience this. This is something that does not exist in Iraq now. As I mentioned, social inequality is way greater now than it used to be. Iraq was a poor country and still is a poor country, but now it's become poorer in all the worst ways. That's what I mean. When you analyze the movement, I don't think there's no point in going into the details. All you need to do is just look up basic statistics, literacy, level of education, calorie intake, the status of women within society, the rights of children within society, access to healthcare, amount of clinics and beds and doctors per person in society. This is all you need to look. And on every single one of these metrics, the previous government had done a better job than the current one, unsurprisingly. Because the current government is not meant to. They don't care for the Iraqi people. You have people who support people who are basically bought out by American capital and serve American interests. You have people who support Iranian interests, and then you have regular people in the middle with the very small subsections, either trying to serve Turkey or play Turkey against Saudi Arabia or vice versa, or Saudi Arabia against Iran, trying to get ahead. But nobody's really caring about the Iraqi people within the political sphere within Iraq. Unlike this was not the case prior with the previous government. We truly did have a national government.
Would you describe Iraq as a new colony today?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure, 110%. It is a failed state, and they thoroughly penetrated by international capital and overrun by the interests of other nations in the region and abroad. So it is not sovereign by any significant definition.
And one last question about yourself that I forgot to ask in the beginning, but it is convenient to ask now. First, how is the internet access in Iraq? Because in Brazil, the internet access is very uneven. It depends on the region, and it is mostly accessed through cell phones. Is there a significant internet coverage in Iraq today?
No, it's exactly like in Brazil. If you're younger, then you'll most likely have internet access, but like you said, it's mostly through cell phones. And it depends if you're urban or rural or whatnot. There's certain areas of Iraq which have zero coverage whatsoever. It's become better nowadays because of like satellite internet plans, and like like where you route a satellite internet connection to like an area and whatnot, like they do in India now as well. Is something that's developed.
Brazil has this too.
Exactly. So now it's become better, but Iraq had internet cafes for way longer than the rest of the world did. internet, where if you want to go access the internet, you specifically have to go to a business somewhere and sit at a desk and pay per minute or whatever.
Even
per
today,
5 minutes, 10 minutes. They still exist, but not very many. Now it's like if you have stuff that you need to do, you can do it on your phone. But the thing is, just because there's internet access doesn't mean that there's any major connectivity. Like, for example, a lot of countries, I'll give you a simple example, online banking, right? A lot of countries have, like when you're from China to Germany to, I'm sure in Brazil as well, your bank has an app on the phone and you can access your
every bank
information.
has it. Yeah,
exactly right. In Iraq, they have this for almost all major bank branches, but they are dog shit. They are really, really bad. Basically, one of the bank branches here has an app that was written in like 2013 or something, and now it's so old that if you have a certain level of the new Androids, you can't download the app anymore.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. Amongst other things, this is another example of the just failures across all Iraqi society.
I wanted to ask you in the beginning, why did you choose to create content in English and not in Arabic?
Two reasons, really. First one is greater audience penetration. Like, I can reach a much larger audience speaking in English than in Arabic, number one. And number two, I want to, I don't know, it feels less personal. Does that make sense? Kind of a selfish reason.
Totally. It makes total sense.
It feels less personal. I like the fact that there's one step removed because it's in English, but mostly because I want to reach a large audience. And to do it in English is to reach others. This is the reason that we're doing this now in English. And also just a hobby.
you like the idea of having like two different personalities. I mean, but not in a bad way, because in my case, my image is compromised. My name is compromised. I get recognized in the streets all the time. It is I am presenting myself to the internet and not another person. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your time. You are a very fast speaker like me. In Portuguese, I speak very fast. In English, not so much. But in Portuguese, I speak very fast. And this is, I rest assured that part of your success, it is the fast speaking. Because nowadays, the audience is they demand fast content and dense content. People in Brazil of the newer generations, the Generation Z, Generation X, they watch movies in double speed. So, it's not only the newer generation, but I speak very fast and people tend to watch me and say, I love your content because it's no bullshit content. I speak fast and I go directly to the point, and I know that you like to create content in that manner too. So
exactly right.
I wanted to thank you again for your participation. I hope this is the beginning of a new part of my channel in which I interview international figures that I admire, that inspired me, that inspire many people in Brazil. And I hope to see you soon back here so we can talk about many things, because we were talking earlier about the subjects, and this was very summarized. This was very quick. And
it could be an episode on each particular point. Exactly right.
Yeah, and we can make another episode about calligraphy, so you can talk about each and every calligraphy that you like, or something more personal, your favorite surah of the Quran. So that would be interesting too.
Yeah, I would love that. Absolutely. To all the people listening, show your man some love. He makes fantastic content always, even though there's a language barrier. I try my best. I use the YouTube what's it called, auto translation to watch your stuff. I remember I told you.
Thank you.
And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I generally do love your work. Do check his episode out on the podcast, on the program. We had him on. We had a fantastic episode. We had a lot of fun. Of course, he's speaking English in it, so I hope that won't be too big of a problem.
I'll try to put subtitles. I swear.
No, it's perfectly fine.
I'll try. I can send you the subtitles so you can put it on YouTube. So it has the subtitles on your video. It doesn't have to be on my channel. I'll try to do that and send you with the timestamps.
Okay, it's perfectly fine.
So thank you again, and hopefully I'll see you on the next episode of Ian speaking very weird English.
I'm looking very forward to it. إلى اللقاء حبيبي.